AWS recommends multi-account architectures for almost every workload, but for most teams, this architecture creates more complexity than security. You see it in documentation, you see it in conference talks everywhere, and you see it in architecture diagrams. The recommendation usually sounds like this. Use separate AWS accounts for security isolation. Use separate accounts for development and production. Use separate accounts for logging, networking, and shared services. And if you follow that advice, very quickly your cloud architecture starts to look like this. A security account, a logging account, a networking account, shared services, multiple development accounts, multiple production accounts. Suddenly, you are running 10 accounts, 20 accounts, sometimes hundreds. And AWS calls this best practice. But here is the problem. AWS is not designing architecture for your system. AWS is designing architecture for their largest customers, banks, telecom companies, large SaaS platforms, organizations with thousands of engineers, compliance departments, and entire teams dedicated to governance. For those organizations, multi-account architecture makes sense because the system constraint they are solving is organizational governance. But most engineering teams are not operating at that scale. Most teams are small, 5 engineers, maybe 10. They share the same deployment pipeline. They share operational responsibility. They debug the same production incidents. And for those teams, the primary system constraint is not governance. That constraint is cognitive load. And this is where the architecture advice breaks down. Because multi-account architecture does not just create isolation, it creates distributed infrastructure. Let's start by looking at identity. In a single account environment, identity and access management is relatively straightforward. You define roles, you define permissions, you manage policies. But when accounts multiply, identity becomes distributed. Roles must assume roles across accounts. Trust relationships must be configured between environments. New permission boundaries begin to appear. Your identity model is no longer configuration. It becomes a distributed identity system. Then there is observability. Logs live in different accounts, metrics live in different accounts, audit trails live in different accounts. So now you need centralized logging pipelines just to understand what your system is doing. Something that used to be operational visibility becomes architecture. Networking becomes more complicated as well. Instead of designing one network, you start designing connectivity between administrative domains. VPC peering, transit gateways, cross-account routing. Networking stops being a system design problem and becomes an organizational coordination problem. And deployments become orchestration. Pipelines assuming roles across accounts. Artifacts moving between environments. Permissions spanning multiple administrative boundaries. All of this complexity is introduced to solve a problem most teams simply do not have: enterprise governance. And this is the systems thinking mistake. Architecture should scale with organizational complexity, not with technology fashion. Multi-account architecture is extremely useful when you have multiple independent teams, regulatory requirements, or strong organizational boundaries. But if you are a small engineering team building a single product, the architecture that AWS recommends can actually increase system complexity dramatically. Instead of simplifying your system, you end up building something else entirely: a distributed organizational infrastructure. AWS is not technically wrong about multi-account architecture, but they are absolutely misleading about when it makes sense. Because architecture advice without context is not best practice, it is cargo cult architecture. And cargo cult architecture is one of the fastest ways to turn a simple system into something nobody fully understands. The real best practice is simple. Architecture should match the scale of the organization operating it, not the scale of Amazon. This is systems thinking for architects. Architecture is judgment, not obedience.